Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on understanding housing needs in your community using data from the American Community Survey. My name is Lisa Sturdivant, and I'm Vice President of Research here at the National Housing Conference. And we are very happy that you decided to join us on this Friday afternoon to talk about using housing data from the American Community Survey. I'd like to thank Capital One for sponsoring NHC's webinar series. We have a series of webinars that you can learn more about on our website, and we are grateful to the sponsorship of Capital One for this particular webinar. We are the National Housing Conference. We are a national organization dedicated to being a resource and providing research around a broad set of affordable housing issues. The Center for Housing Policy is NHC's research division, and one of our main goals is to help housing professionals use data and research to expand affordable housing opportunities. So we're happy to offer this sort of nuts and bolts session on finding and using local housing data from the Census Bureau. Now, we did a session similar to this last year around this time. So if you happen to have attended last year's session, there's going to be a lot of the same material. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that this is going to repeat most of the material that we covered last year with a few nuances, but it does involve sort of a basic look at the American Community Survey and the housing data that are available. So a few introductory notes before we get going. First, let's cover our most frequently asked question: is this being recorded? Yes, it is. An archived copy of this webinar will be made available. We'll send a link out to everyone who registered once the recording is online. And our goal is to get these resources out within 48 hours of the webinar. Second, please note that all participant lines are muted so that we can ensure we have a clear sound quality for everyone. But we are going to take questions during the webinar. So if you have a question at any time during the webinar, please submit it through the question box, which is in the control panel on your GoToWebinar screen. We'll have specific points during the webinar. We'll ask for questions, but do feel free to ask questions at any time as well. And we will answer as many of the questions as we can. Third, technical difficulties. We hope the webinar runs smoothly for everyone, but we know that doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, your best bet is to use the help menu at the top of the GoToWebinar control panel to find technical support. There's also a website for GoToWebinar, support.citrixonline.com. You can let us know you're having trouble in a note in the questions box as well, and we'll try to navigate that from here. But your best bet is probably to go to the GoToWebinar resources. Finally, a portion of this webinar will involve a little bit of hands-on experience, a little bit of work. So we'll provide some instructions for you to go online so that you can put some of the techniques we're going to talk about to practice, to access some data for your community. So you'll be asked to toggle into a browser and go to the Census Bureau's website. And if you have questions as you work through the exercises, you can use the questions box. And what we'll do is after everyone has a few minutes to try the exercise, we'll come back and see how it went, and we'll answer questions. So let's get started. Here is an outline for the webinar today. So we're going to do a little bit of an overview of the American Community Survey. We're going to talk about American FactFinder. And then we're going to go through some steps for accessing housing and population data for local communities, neighborhoods. We're going to do an exercise. We're going to talk about when you run into trouble. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about how do you present this data in order to make a compelling case for housing needs. So really what we want you guys to walk away with is this introduction to the ACS and these very easy to follow steps for finding data for your local community. And then as an outpouring of that, we'll have effective ways then to present this data in order to tell your story. So many of you are familiar with the American Community Survey, so I'll go through this briefly, but the ACS is a survey that basically replaced the decennial census long form and collects lots of good information about households across the country. And it's a continuous survey, which means that it's always in the field. Some of you may have actually received the ACS. And it surveys about 3 million addresses every year. And it is designed so that we can have detailed population and housing characteristics every year, as opposed to waiting for the decennial census, which of course comes out only every 10 years. Now, the more frequent data is a good thing, but there are some limitations about how you can access data for small areas like small cities or small towns. And we'll talk about some of those limitations. So what can you find out from the ACS? You can get lots of good data on demographics, sex, age, race, Hispanic and Latino origin. You can get lots of great information on what we'll call social characteristics, and you can see them listed here. There's a new variable added actually this year for the 2013 ACS on internet and computer access, which is a new field. Last year there was an addition of data on health insurance coverage. So the American Community Survey every year has about the same kinds of variables or characteristics, but they also do update the data they collect periodically in response to different needs. There's data on economic characteristics, including income and employment status, commuting, where people work. And then lastly, there is a whole set of information on housing characteristics. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time today, is looking at the data that we can find from the ACS on housing characteristics for the folks living in your community. So back to the ACS, to differentiate the ACS from the Census Bureau, the ACS data are what are called period estimates. Okay, so they describe the characteristics of a county or city or neighborhood over a specific period. So when we use the 2013 ACS, for example, it describes the characteristics of a community over the entire year, 2013. By contrast, when the census, the decennial census happens, it's called a point-in-time estimate, and it describes the characteristics of an area on a particular date, specifically April 1 of the year of the census. So what happens then is these period estimates get released for as 1-year estimates, 3-year estimates, and 5-year estimates, depending on the size of the place that you're interested in. So just to be a little bit more precise about that, the ACS comes out as a 5-year, a 3-year, or a 1-year estimate. So starting with the 1 year, the 2013 1-year data from the American Community Survey are available for places that have 65,000 or more people. So we call these big places. The 3-year estimates, which are going to be estimates that describe the characteristics of a place over the 2011 to 2013 period, are available for places that have at least 20,000 people. And then the 5-year estimates are available, that would be 2009 to 2013, for all places, so very small places, including census tracts. And so the reason why that's so is that they need to collect data from enough households to make the data reliable. And so at the census tract level, they collect 5 years worth of data, and they sort of aggregate that data up, and then that allows you to say something about the census tract. But the characteristics you'll be describe a period that spans 5 years, right? So that's sometimes okay, but sometimes not super helpful. And we'll talk about what to do if you want to talk about data from a 5-year estimate. You can get American Community Survey data for a variety of geographies. Okay, so this is a chart that shows the different geographies that ACS data are available for. We're going to focus primarily on counties, places, and census tracts, and maybe states. But so we're going to sort of think about how to look for local data as opposed to national data from the ACS. And then this slide just recaps how the ACS is a little bit different from the 2010 census. It has a lot more questions and it has a lot more data about characteristics of households and people, whereas the census is used to get basic counts and to meet the goals of the Constitution, which requires that we count up our population every 10 years. And the data from the American Community Survey are available on American FactFinder down to the census tract level, whereas with the 2010 census, you can actually get data down to the block group level. We'll talk about those census geographies as we go forward. So that's some basic information about the American Community Survey. We're going to talk a lot more about it. If there are questions about the ACS now before we proceed, we'd be happy to take those. We're going to have a chance to actually get online onto the Census Bureau's website to be able to see the data and use the data, and we'll be able to have an opportunity to ask more questions as we actually get online to use the data. So the mechanism through which we're going to access the American Community Survey data is called American FactFinder. So some of you may have used American FactFinder before, and we're going to go through and talk about some basics of using American FactFinder. Some of you may have used American FactFinder and found it very difficult to use, or some of you may have found that it seems like it's different every time you go back to use it. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just pieces of American FactFinder and kind of focus in on what you sort of need to know, which means we're going to skip a whole lot of other things that you can do with FactFinder, but we're going to zero in on what we think is the most important. Before we proceed, there was a quick question about what puts you in the system to receive an American Community Survey. And every single household in the United States is eligible to receive a survey. The Census Bureau works with the Postal Office to create a big file of every single household in the United States, including apartments, including houses. And then there's a special file for group quarters, which includes jails and college dorms and nursing homes. Everybody in America, whether you're a citizen or not, if you have an established residence, so it would exclude folks who live on the street, for example, but everyone else is potentially eligible to receive the survey. So it's a good question. Thanks for that. So we're going to start. I'm just going to give you some screenshots of how to get to the American FactFinder, and then we're going to go through and actually do it online. So on the census.gov's website, you're going to go to Data, and then you're going to go to American FactFinder, which is under Data Tools and Apps. There's lots of other good stuff on the Census Bureau's website, so I recommend that when you have some time to take a look around. This is the main page of the American FactFinder site, and there's lots of things you can do from here. And like I said, I'm going to suggest that there's sort of one way we're going to get at our data, okay? But let me call your attention to some other things. There's a download center which allows you to download block group level data for use with mapping applications and statistical analysis. It's an FTP site. I'm happy to share more information with that offline if folks want to give me a call or send me an email. There's a community facts section where you can go and just type in your neighborhood or your city, and you can get some basic facts that the Census Bureau has compiled from a bunch of different sources. And that's a good sort of, quick overview. We're going to go to the advanced search section of the American FactFinder because that's where you can get the most detailed data and where you can specify which community you want data for. So we're going to go to advanced search. I would strongly discourage you from going through the guided search option on American FactFinder. It seems to me that it's trying to help you, but it leads you to places you may not want to go. So sort of like when Microsoft Word corrects you on something that you know is spelled correctly, but it's guiding you to a different place. the guided search is, in my opinion, sort of like that. So we're going to stick with the advanced search. So, and we're going to do the show me all under advanced search. So when we do go to this advanced search option, and again, we're going to go online and do this. This is the main screen. And we're going to pay very close attention to 3 boxes. We're going to pay attention to the Your Selections box, which is up in the top left. And then we're going to use the Topics and the Geographies drop-down menu. There's other drop-down menus there, right? And we are probably not going to want to use any of them for the type of analysis we're going to do on housing affordability and housing markets. The one exception may be in the race and ethnic groups drop-down, and I'll tell you what I mean when we get to that point. But so the Your Selections, the Topics, and the Geographies boxes are really where we're going to spend most of our time. Under Geographies, this is where you tell American FactFinder what place you want data for. And there's a bunch of different ways you can tell American FactFinder. There's a list option, a name option, an address option, and a map option. We're going to look at the name and the address options in this webinar, but you can also look at the other ways to get to where you tell American FactFinder what place you're interested in getting data for. Under the Topics boxes, we're going to be concerned with the data set we want to use, and we're going to want to use, most of the time, the most recent American Community Survey. And we're also going to use the People and the Housing boxes because that's where we find the variables, right, or the data that we want to use for whatever analysis we're going to do. So there's lots of other topics in there: business and government, business and industry, governance, product type. I would suggest that all we need really are these 3 for what we do. So that's the main structure of American FactFinder. And before we go on to doing our exercise and for actually pulling down data from American FactFinder, are there questions about how FactFinder works or how it's set up? It is still a work in progress, I think, a little bit by the Census Bureau, but for the most part, it is available now and is fairly unchanging. The FactFinder, someone asked, it's Mac compatible, and it is. You just need a browser, right? You just need an internet browser, and so there should be no trouble with using it through any type of browser. I haven't had any trouble with Chrome or Explorer or any of the different types of browsers, so it should be good to go. Okay, let's do something with FactFinder here now. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to look up housing and population data for your local community. So as we all know, working on housing issues, that housing markets are local, housing needs are local, and so the one of the most beneficial things about the American Community Survey is that it does provide us with the ability to get down, frankly, to the neighborhood level, if we want to call a census tract a neighborhood. A census tract is a census-defined area that has between around 10,000, usually between 2,000 and 12,000 people, depending on what state you're in. So that's kind of the closest to a neighborhood that we can get. Now, census tracts don't usually correspond to neighborhoods like you might know in your community, but they are a good approximation. But the ACS also allows you to go to the county level, the city level, the town level, and so that's the reason why I think the ACS is a really good source of information for looking at housing needs at the local level. Secondly, it's fairly recent, right? So the most recent data are for 2013, and the Census Bureau is committed to getting data out within 11 months of the end of the year. That's sort of the commitment. So we should have 2014 data no later than November, which for any of you who work with surveys and data, that's pretty good to get data out in that short of a time, particularly when you have millions of records like the ACS does. So that's why we're using the ACS data. So what I'm going to suggest here is that when we're talking about getting ACS data for a neighborhood, we're going to use American FactFinder, and I would recommend that we write down 3 things as we start our process. We're going to write down first, and this is just so that we can sort of keep track of what we're doing as we go through. What geographic area do you want to know something about? And we're going to limit our analysis to either census tracts, cities, or counties. Someone had asked about block level data. There are no block level data from the ACS. There are block group level data available from the Census Bureau's FTP site, but not from American FactFinder. So you have to have a statistical application or GIS to use block group ACS data. Okay. So we're going to determine what area we want to know something about. We're going to figure out what ACS data set is appropriate. Remember, for big places, you can use 1-year data. For medium places, we're going to use 3-year data. And then for small places, we have to use 5-year data. So we're going to keep that in mind. Second thing we're going to write down is what do we want to know, right? And the reason why this is important is some of the data are saved in what are called data profiles, which are pretty easily accessible, lots of great information. You don't need to do much digging. You can be in and out pretty quickly. And so we want to know and be familiar with what's in the data profiles, because if that's the information we want to know something about, it's pretty straightforward. So we'll come back to the data profiles. And then finally, we want to know, look, what time period do we want? Do we want just the most recent information, or do we want to do some sort of comparison over time and go back to 2010, for example? The ACS has been around since 2006, and we can pretty easily compare ACS data with 2010 and 2000 with 2000 census data, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about looking at data over time. Okay, I'm going to go through the steps here in PowerPoint, and then I'm going to go through the steps on the Census Bureau's website, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're going to get a chance to go through an exercise yourself. So the first thing you want to do is you want to select your geography. Now, there's lots of different ways to get to data on the American FactFinder, and I'm recommending that you select your geography first because it helps narrow down other things. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. But one of the ways to get to your geography is to start with an address, and that will tell you all of the different geographies that are available to you. Another way to get to the geography is to click on the name tab and type the name of the place. Okay, so I'm going to toggle back over to the American FactFinder, and I'm going to go to Data Tools and to American FactFinder, and I'm going to go to Advanced Search and Show Me All. So when I was talking about the geographies, you're going to select on Geographies, and then here's where you would click on the Address tab, and you would put your address tab. You would put your address in here, and you would get a number of different geographies. So I'll type in the address of NHC. And when you click on Go, what the American FactFinder is doing is it's basically finding that address, and it picked up Northwest, which is good because I forgot to put that, and it will tell you all of the geographies that are associated with that address. You can see there's a state. Well, we all know D.C. is not a state, but for the purposes of the Census Bureau it is. D.C. is also a county for the purposes of the Census Bureau. And then you can see what block, census tract, block group, and so on is associated with this address. The other way you could do it is you could click on the name tab and just type in District of Columbia and click on Go. So we'll come back to that when we do our exercises. So step one is really to select your geography. The second step is to select your data set. So under the topics box, we're going to click on data sets. and then we're going to click on the most recent ACS data. Okay, and it's at the top of the list usually. So we're going to click on the appropriate file. So the second step is then to select your data set. So we'll come back to that in just a second. The third step then is to select the information that you want. So we're going to ask ourselves the question, is the information we want in one of the 4 data profiles? And those tables will be at the top of the list of tables you'll see. And if that's the case, then we're good to go. We're done. And we can click on the table that we need. And we're going to start to become familiar with what's in the data profiles. But if the data you want aren't in the data profiles, we're going to navigate the topics drop-downs again, and we're going to click on either people or housing, and we're going to click the topic that we care about. Okay, so let me do an example here. So I live in a neighborhood called Arlandria in Alexandria, Virginia, and this is a small place. By that I mean this is a neighborhood, so it's probably going to be a census tract that I'm going to be interested in. And I want information on the number of renters versus owners in the neighborhood, and I also want to know something about rent burden by age. Okay, there's other things, but that's what I want to start with. And I want to know that for the most recent time period. And I know that I'm going to have to use 5-year data because it's a small place. That's why the most recent data available are this 2009 to 2013. So I'm going to have information that describes the characteristics of this neighborhood over the 2009 to 2013 period. Okay, so let me go and show you how this looks back here on FactFinder. So I'm going to go to Geographies. I'm going to go to Address. And because I'm interested in the Arlandria neighborhood, I'm going to pick an address within Arlandria that I happen to know is in Arlandria to find the geography associated with that address. Okay, so these are all the geographic elements associated with that address, but I want to choose the census tract. So what you do is you click right here on the census tract. It's census tract 2012.03, right? So I don't think anybody knows the census tract number of where they live, but every place in America is associated with the census tract. But I'm going to click on that and watch where it went, right? If you look up in your selections box, you can see that the census tract is now up in the Your Selections box. You need to pay attention to that because that is where it tells you the criteria that you've specified to American FactFinder. Okay. What we want to do is click on Close after we've selected our geography. So if you click on Close, you can see then that we selected our geography. The second step is we need to select our data set, right? So we go to Topics, and then we go to Data Set. You'll notice that the data set at the top are the ACS 5-year estimates. We don't get a choice of 1-year or 3-year estimates because we already told FactFinder it's a small place, and it's saying, well, the only data available from the ACS are the 5-year estimates. So we're going to click on the 5-year estimates and notice that that goes up into the selection box. I'm going to close this box just for a second. One thing you can see here is that this number up here tells you that there's 939 tables from the ACS about my census tract, which is 938 more than I want. So there's a lot of information there. So we want to narrow it down a little bit. And the first thing we wanted to know was how many renters versus how many owners are there in this neighborhood. So what I want you to take a look at when you do this on your own is these 4 tables up at the top. These are the 4 data profiles. Okay, and they correspond to those 4 sets of information that are available from the American Community Survey. I'm going to click on this table right here. They all have names, and they also have numbers. This happens to be called DP04, for what it's worth. the housing characteristics is what we want to look at, and it's the data profile. For every place in the American Community Survey, you will have a data profile for housing, and you can scroll through and you can see all of the basic housing information that are available in these data profiles. And the stuff you might want to know, the information you might want for your community might be right here, and you might not have to go any further. So I'm interested in how many renters and how many owners there are, and that falls under housing tenure, which is right here in the middle of the data profile. Housing tenure is how the Census Bureau talks about renters versus owners. And so what I'm finding is there's 2,346 households or occupied housing units in this census tract. 374 of them are owner-occupied and 1,972 are renter-occupied. So the homeownership rate in this neighborhood is 15.9%, which you can see right here. And that might answer my first question, right? I wanted to know the number of renters versus the number of owners. So this is a neighborhood where there are far more renters than owners. Okay, so let me click back to where we were before by clicking on Back to Advanced Search. And I'm just going to uncheck this box just because we don't need that anymore. But the second thing we wanted to know is we wanted to know the rent burden by age of household. We could go back and look through that data profile, and there is data about the percentage of income renters spend on housing, but there's nothing that breaks it out by different kinds of households, like by age of the household or any other characteristic of the household. That's called a cross tabulation, right, where you sort of have two pieces of information that you want to combine into one table. So, so what we want to do then is we want to specify the information that we're most interested in. Okay, and so what we wanted to know was the rent burden by age of head of household. So I'm going to go to topics, and remember these are the two that I'm going to use, people and housing. So let's go to housing first, because rent burden is the first thing I'm interested in. And there's lots of different data on housing, and rent data are under the financial characteristics drop-down. So I invite you to sort of look and see what's under the other segments here, physical characteristics, occupancy characteristics. But for rent burden, we're going to go to financial characteristics, and we're going to click on gross rent. Okay, there's gross rent, and then there's contract or asked rent, but for most of the time you're going to want to use gross rent. So let's click on that. I'm going to close this just for a second. What you see up here now is we've narrowed this down. So now it's only going to show us 17 tables. There's only 17 tables that have anything to do with rent, gross rent. So that's pretty good. That's better than 939. But we still might want to narrow it down even further because we're interested in seeing rent as a share of income for different ages, right? So let's go back to topics. And instead of housing, let's look at people. Okay? And so if we go to income, we can select income, and that will go up there. And then we can go back to people, and we can select age of the householder. If you look up here in the selections box, you can see all of the criteria that we have set here in American FactFinder. And what ended up happening is we narrowed down to just one table. And it turns out that this is the table that I think that we want. So let's click on it. And so what you see here, up here is the title will tell you what the table shows. And the data for the census tract, the geography will be right up here at the top of the table. And then this is what you'll get. You'll get, in this case, the total number of households headed by people who are different ages. And then you'll get, right below them, the percentage of their income that they spend on rent. And this is the basis for which you can calculate cost burden, right? Or the share that spend 30% or more of their income on rent. Okay, so these are the basic steps for accessing data for, in this case, a census tract. You can access data for multiple census tracts by going to geographies and then going to census tract, and then American FactFinder will ask you to specify what state and what county you want all the census tracts for. So county's kind of a base for which American FactFinder is going to pull your geography. So if you wanted all the census tracts from your county, American FactFinder will step you through it by clicking on census tract. Again, as I mentioned, you can get block group data. You used to only be able to get block group data from FTP, but it looks like you can get block group data as well from American FactFinder. So there are other ways to get information about geographies and to see the census tracts in your neighborhood. And so I invite you to explore the mapping tab, where you narrow down to a county and then to lower level, and it will show you the census tract numbers for your county and for other levels of geography. So there's lots of different ways to get at the geography that you're interested in. What you're seeing right now is the census tract we have in our selections box, and it sort of overlays over your street map, and it's a very rudimentary map. So if you're interested in more sophisticated mapping, I would argue that you should download the data from the FTP site and then do that in your own GIS. Okay, so let me return to the PowerPoint here. So this is just a screenshot of the data we just got from American FactFinder. I want to spend just a minute talking about margins of error. Okay, so the data from the American Community Survey are survey data, and survey data have error inherently built into them. And error in this case doesn't mean mistakes. It just means that because the survey only asks a portion of the population, the numbers are never going to be 100%. No one's ever going to be 100% sure that the numbers are correct. So there's some uncertainty about whether the numbers are, this estimate is the actual number, or whether it's something a little bit greater or a little bit smaller. And so the margin of error in this case says that when we look at the total number of households or renters, there's 1,972 renters estimated to live in this census tract. But that has a margin of error of plus or minus 222. So that means that there could be 222 fewer or 222 more households than the estimate. So you might say, well, how can I use that information? That's pretty uncertain. Maybe, or maybe not, right? So it's definitely an error that you have to be aware of, and sometimes it does make a difference. So if, for example, if you look under the householders age 15 to 24 and you look at the share spending less than 20% of their income on rent, which is the first zero estimate, according to the ACS, nobody in this age group spends less than 20% of their income on rent. But it has a margin of error plus or minus 17, which means the number could be anything from negative 17 to plus 17. Well, that doesn't really make any sense, right, to have negative 17 households. So I would use that number very, very, very cautiously. And so way that you can think about it is you can report it, and then you can mention the margin of error, and you can say that there's a lot of uncertainty about this particular number. The margin of error is less problematic when you have bigger estimates, right? So the bigger your geography, the less likely these margins of error are going to cause you any angst or trouble. Now, I'll say, we've been using census data from the decennial census for a long time, 2000, 1990, 1980. when we used the long form data back then, that was a survey too, and there were margins of error associated with that as well. So I think the thing to just be aware of is that if you're going to be making decisions based on ACS data for very small areas, that because it's a survey, there's this margin of error that gets introduced. And we can talk more about that when we talk about how to present this data. But right now it's your turn, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up these 4 slides. These are the ones that we just saw. And what I want you to do is write down the answers to these 3 questions. What area do you want to know something about? What information do you want to know? And let's just use the same information that I did with my example. What time period do you want? And let's use the most recent just to make it a little bit easier. And then I'm going to let you guys go on to the Census Bureau's website, census.gov. And then you're going to go under Data Tools, and you're going to go to American FactFinder. And then you will try and pull the tables that you need to answer these questions. So I'm going to put myself on mute for a few minutes, and I'm going to let you all give it a shot. If you run into issues as you're going along, type them in the questions box, and I'll pop back on and answer them. And then we'll have a chance to ask questions after you've had an opportunity to go online yourself. Okay, great. Have fun. And I look forward to hearing how it goes. I hope it's going well. I have a question here about the difference between a place within a state, an estimates universal place, and an economic place. We're going to want a place within a state for the ACS data. The other 2 kinds of places actually tie into different data sets. And places are a good geography for unincorporated areas of counties, for example. The Census Bureau uses counties and county equivalents a lot, but there's some things that aren't counties, but that have their own distinct character. And some of them are cities, so they don't have a city geography. You have to use this place geography. So you might find that place is what you want for the town or city that you're looking up. And you'll want to do a place within a state as opposed to estimates universal place or economic place. So that was a question that came in. If anyone has other questions, feel free, and we'll give folks a few more minutes to find their data. So again, there's a question about why we start with geography, and the reason I start with geography is it will then limit your options on what data set you can choose. If you choose your data set first, and then you try and choose your geography, if you've chosen a data set where there's no data for your place, it gets frustrating, right? You don't understand why you can't find your place when you go through the steps to list the geography. The data set will choice, if you do that first, let's say you choose the 2013 ACS, the one-year file as your data set, but then you want to go look up data for your small town. You're not going to be able to find your small town, right, because the one-year file doesn't have data for small places. So I think it's better to start with geography. For precisely the reason the questioner asked is it starts to limit it in a way that's helpful as opposed to confusing. There's a question here about urbanized areas within a county's data that I don't know the answer to. So I will find out. There were changes to how the Census Bureau handles urbanized areas, and I'm not sure how the most recent ACS data handles that. So for the person who asked that question, thanks for that question. Hold that thought, and maybe we can follow up by email. For those of you who are doing the exercise, just so you know, I'm not doing anything with the slides. They're just static right now. You guys are working on the Census Bureau's website. I've just left the slide up here so that you can see some steps. But I'm going to come back on in like 2 minutes, and we'll advance the slides and keep the presentation going. There's also a question here about how to compare data for different groups. And I'm going to cover that here in just a few minutes. So hold that thought on using margins of errors to compare groups. That's a good question. So 2 more minutes. And if you don't have a chance to get the data, that's fine. Keep the questions coming, though, if you run into issues, and then we'll keep rolling. Okay, so you may not be done, and I apologize for rushing the process. I hope you have time to go through this a little bit more after the webinar, but there's a few more things I want to talk about to answer some of the questions people have raised, and also to talk about other things with ACS. And I'm also going to talk about some troubleshooting items. And let me do that now, and then also respond to a couple of additional questions that are coming in. So Sometimes you can't find your geography, and so what I would suggest is to try all of the different ways we talked about. Use the address lookup feature. If you don't see what you need, go to the name and then start with the county. Let's say that you want a place. Start with the county that place is located in, and then what you'll get is you'll get a list of all the geographies in that county. The Census Bureau organizes things by county. Like that's its main geography by which it organizes its data on American FactFinder, so that's another way. The other thing to make sure is that check your selections box. Make sure there's not a geography already selected from a prior search, and if there is, you need to delete it by clicking the little X next to it. So that's another thing to try if you can't find your geography. So if you can't find the American Community Survey data you want for your geography, let's say you want 1-year data, you might have chosen a geography that's too small. Okay? And so what you need to do is you need to select a larger geography, or you need to choose the multi-year data set. So sort of related to that, if you have an interest in finding data, I think I mentioned this, for all census tracts, what you need to do is under geography, go to the name tab and type the county that you're interested in. And what you'll see in the drop-downs is an option to select census tracts in the county, all census tracts in the county. And that's how you can pull all census tracts at one time, and you can get all the tables for all the census tracts all at one time. And so that's one way that's probably the easiest way to get census tract data for multiple census tracts in one query. Another issue you might run into is you might go through and use the topics and the people and the housing, and then you end up with no tables. So you don't see anything, and you don't know why. So what I would suggest is remove one of the topics from the selection that you've made. So if you've sort of selected characteristics of the people and something about their rent and something about whether they're owners or renters, and all of a sudden you're looking for tables but no tables are showing, remove one of the features, whether it's the ownership versus renter, or remove one of the characteristics to see if some tables pop up. And if there's less than 20 tables that show, then you can start to scroll through and click on the tables and see if it's got the data that you want. The ACS data can be compared to the 2010 data, and I've provided a link, which of course you'll have access to when I send the PowerPoint out, where you can find the equivalent table from 2010 so that you can make comparisons over time. And then the margins of error for the data you found might be really, really big. And I think I mentioned that if you're looking at small places, or if you're looking at data for small groups, you might have these really big margins of error. And I would suggest that you either find another piece of information, or you decide you're going to look at a larger geography, or you use the data. I mean, it's the best we've got. People will understand this. If you're using this for writing grants, for example, if you're using this for presenting to a local planning commission or to other supporters, this is the source of data for this. And so I would use it, and I do use it even when there's large margins of errors, and just have caveats. So the margins of error are just to tell you how reliable the data are, and we've talked about that. And so what you might do is you might want to make comparisons either between places, right, or over time, or for two different groups of people, so say two different groups of households with two different ages, or groups of different races. And so 3 things to mention on making comparisons either between places, between groups, or over time. Use the same period estimates if you're going to compare 2 places. What I mean by that is if you want to compare your small neighborhood to your big county, you should use 5-year data for both the county and the small place. Like, use the lowest common denominator, basically. So if you're going to use 5-year data to look at a neighborhood set of data and you want to compare that neighborhood to the county, use the 5-year data for the county as well. Even though the 1-year data are available, you want to use the same period estimate. So don't compare 1-year estimates to multi-year estimates. And if you're using multi-year estimates, you don't want to use estimates that overlap. Like, you don't want to use 2009 to 2013 data and compare it to 2008 to 2012 data because they overlap. So that's, and I'm happy to follow up with folks who have more questions about that. But I've gotten some good questions. I've answered, I think, a bunch of the questions that came in. But let me look here. There was a question about data on the homeless population, and there is no data in the ACS about people with no fixed address. And so the best source of data really come from HUD's homelessness survey. There's state-level surveys. There's point-in-time estimates that local governments do. But there's no one source on American FactFinder that come in. The data, there's a question about colleges and about if there's a way to exclude student renters. And one way, the only way that I can think of doing that easily on American FactFinder is to exclude any renter below a certain age, which is not ideal. I get that. But the renter data is only for households, so it won't include people in dorms. But it will include a renter population that live in households that may be students. You can exclude folks who are under 24, which, of course, I get is not ideal. Unfortunately, the next thing you'd have to do is to really drill down with the microdata, which I'll mention in a minute before we end. There's a question about the difference between ACS and demographics now. I don't know what demographics now is, NOW, so if the questioner follows up with me, I can find out a little bit more, and happy to dig into that a little bit. We have about 25 minutes left in our scheduled webinar, so I want to talk just briefly about how to present some of the data that we get from the American Community Survey. This is the table, right, that you get when you do this exercise to look at rent burden by age of the household. I'm guessing that this is not something you want to put in your grant proposal, or it's not something you want to put up on a PowerPoint presentation. So this idea of making it look a little bit more pleasing in Excel usually is something that I would suggest. So what I'm going to flip to here is how you might convert the ACS table to something a little bit more pleasing. So ignore the bottom half of the table for a second, because that was information we could have looked up, but we didn't. But the top of the table corresponds to the basic table we got from American FactFinder. And so we wanted to report out on cost burden, right? Folks spending 30% or more of their income on rent. But as you notice, the American FactFinder table split it out as folks who spend 30 to 34.9% and folks who spend 35% or more. But I want to combine those two numbers, right? Because I feel like I want to talk about the typical measure of cost burden, okay? So that means I need to manipulate the data a little bit. I need to, for each of my age groups, I can report the total number of renters, which I can pull right off the American FactFinder table. Then I can find the total number of households who spend 30% or more of their income on rent. I have to add two numbers together, right? The people who are 30 to 34.9, and then the people who are 35 and over. And then I need to calculate the percentage. So the American FactFinder doesn't have percentages for these crosstabs. You have to do it yourself. So that's why it's handy to do it in Excel or to have a calculator out in order to do this. And so what this really demonstrates is by age group, it says the share of households, the share of renters who spend 30% or more of their income on a rent. That's better. I think this is a better way to show it than just printing out the table from American FactFinder. So if you had a chance to download your data, I've given you like a little blank form here that you can fill out. I'm gonna keep going though, so if you wanted to give that a shot, you're more than welcome to. The thing I want to mention is if we go back here to our table that we had here, all of the numbers are right here, so we can key them into Excel ourselves. But alternatively, we may want to download this table, right? So there's a download option at the top, and I would strongly encourage that you want to download the table in Microsoft Excel if you want to make your own tables. And so then you click on Microsoft Excel, and then you click on OK. And so you're going to get this table that you can then open up in Excel. Just a few tips here, because it's frustrating. There are hidden columns that you need to delete. So you'll notice here, and this is not just with this table, this is with every single table you'll download from American FactFinder. You'll have to delete these two empty columns. You'll get these weird rows that are empty, which I always delete as well. And then the last thing I'll mention is all of these numbers that have been downloaded from the Census Bureau website are saved as text fields instead of numbers. What that means is you can't use Excel to perform calculations because Excel's treating them as text instead of numbers. So you have to select them and use this little option in Excel to convert them to numbers. And then you can add and subtract and divide them. This is one of the most annoying parts of downloading data from American FactFinder, and it can be really frustrating. So keep in mind that when you do download data, you are going to have to do a little bit of manipulation. You'll see columns C and D are also empty here. There's also two other columns that end up needing to be deleted. So I don't have a better solution than that. If you just want to see this table and print it out for someone, you can download it as a PDF, and that would be defined. But if you want to manipulate it in Excel, that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, what I might suggest is that you don't necessarily want to present data in a table. And so for those of you who are familiar with Excel, you know that you can make charts in Excel. The chart on the top left just puts the numbers that we have put in the table, it puts them onto bar charts, and it shows the number of renter households who spend 30% or more of their income on rent. And you can see that the largest number is people aged 35 to 64. And you can see that there's, you can see how that looks here. What I'll point out is when you make a chart, I suggest that you make sure you have a good title, that you have the year in the title, and that you have the source down at the bottom. Those are always good things to keep in mind. But I think there's a benefit to, instead of presenting the total numbers, to present the share, because when I do this table down here in the bottom right, it tells the share of households that are cost burdened, and you can see the cost burden is more prevalent among younger households, even though they're a smaller number in the population. So it's up to you. So this is working in Excel. So as I mentioned, you're going to download the data into Excel and clean it up a little bit. Someone asked if there's an Excel script or macro where you can clean up the data you're downloading from the census. That's a great question, and I don't know. I've never found one, but I haven't spent a lot of time looking for it. Maybe my tolerance for tedium is not as great as it should be, or it's not as low as it should be, because I've just done it by hand every time. So if you come up with a good way to automate the cleanup of downloaded files from American FactFinder, please do loop me in. I would love to hear about it. A couple other things on presenting data. When you show change, there's a couple different ways to show change. So what I'm doing is I'm showing the change in the number of households who are rent burdened, in the city of Fredericksburg, Virginia, between the year 2000 and then between the year 2010 to 2012. And so what I'm finding is that the number of households has increased by 1,185. Okay, that's a 54.9% increase. So I just would, calculate the difference and then divide by the base number, or divide by 2157. So that means that the number of households who are cost burdened has increased by 54.9% over this period. Okay. Another way to present it is to show, is to show how the share of cost burden households has changed over time. In 2000, it was 42.9%, and in 2010 to 2012, it was 56.3%. So this is a 13.4 percentage point increase. Okay, and so that's different than percent increase. So I would just caution you that when you're talking about changes in percentages, that you talk about it just a little bit differently. Don't do this. So this is what folks do a lot, is they'll change the scale of the axis on the left. You see how in this slide the axis goes from 0 to 60, which shows a change in the sizes of the bars. This change is much more dramatic, right, because it goes from 40 to 60. It's also a little misleading. And so I would argue that when you're showing change over time with a graph, always start your axis at 0. Despite the appeal of making the change seem larger, you can sometimes raise people's skepticism that way. So just my commentary. You can take it for what it is. The other thing you might do is you might compare the percentages of people who are cost burdened in 2 different places. So I'm making each bar a place, the city of Fredericksburg and the state of Virginia. And both data come from the same 3-year file, even though we could get data for Virginia from the 1-year file. Because I'm comparing 2 places, I wanted to use the same file. And so then what I've done here is I've shown the percent of the population with a bachelor's degree. So this is just a different set of data, but I wanted to demonstrate something. So you can see that 34.9% of the population in Fredericksburg have a bachelor's degree or higher, and 34% of people in Virginia, the state, have a bachelor's degree or higher. So at first glance, it looks like people in Fredericksburg are generally more educated than people in the state of Virginia. But I would caution you that this is where the margins of errors could come into play, and someone had asked a question about this, comparing groups. And so what I'm showing is that the margin of error for Fredericksburg is 3.7%, and the margin of error for Virginia is 0.2%. So what you do is you subtract the margin of error off the estimate, and then you add it to the estimate. So that gives you this range. It's called the confidence interval. And if the confidence intervals overlap, okay, which you can see they do based on the arrows below, we say that we can't say with any confidence that these 2 numbers are different. So they're not, you might have heard, statistically significantly different. They're not significantly different. So as someone just asked, yeah, I'd report it as being about the same. And I certainly wouldn't make any big claims that Fredericksburg is somehow different than Virginia. Because of this margin of error, it's suggesting that these 2 places are more alike than they are different on this characteristic. So that's one way I really do use margins of error, when I'm comparing places or where I'm comparing groups. Okay, so that was a very quick sort of how to present data in tables. Think about whether showing numbers or percentages is best. Showing change, think about what data set you're going to use. Start your axis on your graph at 0. Think about whether you want to talk about how numbers are changing or how percentages are changing. And then, again, use the same ACS period if you're going to compare geographies. And the smallest geography will really determine which ACS file you're going to use. So are there questions? I've had some good questions. I think I've had a chance to answer most of them. Are there other questions on how you might think about presenting data, either from the American Community Survey or for somewhere else? I'm going to spend just the last few minutes talking about other places to find data. As I said, the ACS is a great source for finding local data on housing and population. We just looked at two pieces of information for this exercise. I invite you to spend some time. I'm not sure what your weekend plans are, but spend some time on American FactFinder, and you can see that there's lots and lots of different data available. If you follow those 3 steps, it might reduce some frustration that is likely just because there's so much data on there. By choosing your geography first and then your data set, it sometimes helps narrow down things in an easier way. Also keep an eye on that selections box in the top left-hand corner of your screen. If you get too many things up there, you're going to limit it too much and you're not going to get any data at all, and that can be frustrating as well. So just keep those things in mind as you're exploring the American FactFinder. There are other places to find local data, and then again, I'm going to be sending out a link to this PowerPoint, and so all of these URLs you see on the slides will be available so you can click on them and get to them directly on the web. Some of you may be familiar with CHAS data, which is a summary of some of the cost burden data, and it does go down to the place level. Someone was asking about places, so census places. It's a little bit delayed, though. So it's usually a year, sometimes 2 years behind the American Community Survey because they take some time and manipulate the data and put it into a format where you can access it in, frankly, a little bit easier way. But if you're willing to put in a little time, you can actually get the same information you get in the CHAS data. You can get from the American FactFinder, but more recently. Most of the same. I shouldn't say everything. So the cost burden data, though, you can get from American FactFinder. I'll also point you to a mapping tool that the Census Bureau has called On the Map. This is for folks who like to look at things visually, and it combines ACS data with other survey data as well as administrative data. And it's really cool for looking at the incomes and housing characteristics of people based on where they live and where they work. So you could actually take your place and look at who comes into your community to work. Where are they coming from? What kind of incomes do they make? Which can be really helpful if you're doing a needs analysis. If you want to think about how to accommodate, how to develop a housing policy that accommodates your workforce. And it's at the tract level. If you're really good with mapping, you can actually import your own geography to the On the Map tool, and you can then do analysis for places that you've defined as opposed to places that the Census Bureau defined. Again, the data are a little bit delayed, so you just have to keep that in mind. The Urban Institute, many of you may know, has a site out called a Housing Assistance Matters Initiative, where it's basically a gap analysis, where it not only looks at the demand, right, that is the households at different incomes and how much housing they can afford, but it's combined that information with the supply and how much housing is affordable and available to different income groups. And you can look at this for counties and cities, and it uses ACS data as well. You can't go below the county level, but you can get down to the city level, and it's really interesting to take a look at that. And the last one I'll mention is the HUD and Department of Transportation Location Affordability Portal. And so what this does is it combines data from the American Community Survey as well as other data to look at the combined housing and transportation costs for different household types. And I'm going to go there really quickly just because I think when we're talking about housing affordability, being able to look at the combined cost of housing and transportation is actually of interest to a lot of people. And so when you go here, it's set up it's different than American FactFinder, but some ways it may be more intuitive. You get to enter your place. You can enter a zip code. You can enter an address, and it'll find your zip code. And instead of showing data in tables, it'll show data on the average housing costs, the average transportation costs, and the average total H+T costs for that geography. In this case, it's a census tract, the same one we were looking at before. And it allows you to look at these H+T costs for different kinds of households. And these households are all set up to be similar, but the incomes for these households will vary depending on what metro area you're in. But you can look at these for moderate income families, for very low income individuals, for retired couples, and you can get some good information on how the housing plus transportation costs factor in. So the HUD data that someone asked a question about, that using transit systems for rural areas that have demand response transportation. So the data on transportation usage come from responses to the American Community Survey. So they're going to miss data that's not for commuting, first of all, and they're going to, so transportation data that are not primarily for commuting, and they might miss transportation modes that don't fit into one of the choices on the survey. So I think that I would think about, I want to know a little bit more about my specific place as I'm thinking about what kind of transportation data there are. But you get to know a little bit about like how many vehicles on average a family owns, how often, how much they drive, how many transit trips they take as well, etc. So so this is really interesting to me because sometimes housing costs look really high in a place, but it turns out that the transportation costs are relatively low, and it makes you can have a really good conversation. You can zoom out and see how a region looks. The darker colors means higher H+T costs. This is the Washington, D.C. metro area. The lighter colors mean lower housing plus transportation costs. You can change it up for different fleet types. If we look for very low income folks, well, that's a little tricky one because it looks like they're very, very burdened. If we look at moderate income families, you can sort of see how the H+T costs vary. So I invite you to play around with that. There are data you can download as well if you're so inclined. So I really appreciate you guys sticking with us for the webinar. As I mentioned, we're going to be emailing you a link to this presentation, and you can then contact me directly if you have questions. My information is available here. You can also go on our website, nhc.org. If you have suggestions for future webinars around this topic, I would love to hear about them. And when you're on NHC's website, if you aren't a member of NHC, I would encourage you to look at the information we have there about becoming a member of NHC. We'd love to expand our network. We learn from you as much as we hope that that you can learn from us, and we look forward to continuing having a relationship with you all through these webinars and through our other events and publications. So I'm going to stop there. If there are other questions, please feel free to post them to the question box. And otherwise, I'll look forward to getting an email from us with a link to the presentation. We will try and get this out. We try and aim for within 48 hours. It is Friday afternoon and Monday is a holiday, so let's say Tuesday. Although I will do my best to do it as soon as possible, I would argue probably Tuesday is likely. If there are other questions, I will take them. Otherwise, thanks a lot and have a great weekend.